good evening, everybody. Welcome to our guest author discussion for this evening. My name is Keisha Miller. I'm Teen Librarian and Volunteer Coordinator here at South Orange Public Library. Well, sort of, kind of here, as you can tell from my background. I am joined by my colleague, Michael Pucci, who is Head of Communications and Collection Development. And we have a lovely, lovely author joining us this evening. Her name is Jeannie Gainburg. And before we give a brief background about Jeannie, I do want to share with you that tonight she'll be discussing her book, The Savvy Ally, a guide for becoming a skilled LGBTQ plus advocate. And so if you've ever had a question or you've been in conversation, whether how you could be a better ally, Jeannie will definitely go through current and relevant information to help identify and help kind of smooth over those bumps in the road that you may come across in becoming a better ally and advocate for the LGBTQ plus community. This book is great, I must say. Oh, it is an easy read, laced with some humor, and I always appreciate that. And we're hoping that you get a chance to read the book. We will have a couple copies available at the library, soon to be cataloged. And if you have any questions, we can take those towards the end. So I'm going to pass it along to my colleague, Michael, who will give a brief biography of Jeannie Gainburg. And then we'll have Jeannie, we'll welcome Jeannie to the virtual stage. Michael?
Thank you, Keisha. So just a brief bio on Jeannie. Jeannie Gainburg is an educational trainer and consultant in the field of LGBTQ plus inclusion and effective allyship. Formerly the education director at the Out Alliance in Rochester, New York, she has personally facilitated or co-facilitated more than 500 trainings and workshops in more than 20 different states at corporations, colleges, government agencies, K-12 schools, hospitals, faith communities, and more. Jeannie has a bachelor's in psychology from Brown University and a master's in social work and social research from Bryn Mawr College. She's also a Columbia High School alum, so very familiar with South Orange. In 2019, she received a citation from the New York State Assembly for distinguished educational and human rights services for her work in promoting LGBTQ plus rights and inclusion. And as Keisha said, the occasion that brings us together is the publication of her new book, The Savvy Ally, published earlier this year. And like Keisha said, very engaging. Whatever the opposite of dry is, that's what this book is. So Jeannie's going to read a little bit from her book, but Jeannie, maybe before you do that, we could talk a little bit about your journey to allyship, because I think it's pretty interesting, and what led you to write this book.
Sorry, I was having a little trouble unmuting there. Okay, thank you so much for that nice welcome. Hi everyone, nice to be virtually back in South Orange. I wish I was actually there. When I wrote my email to make this connection, I was saying that the one thing I really miss is Reservoir Pizza, and I kind of wish we were all having this book talk around a good pizza. You cannot get good pizza in Rochester, New York, so that stinks. Otherwise, it's lovely here. I'm really thrilled to be here. I'm really looking forward to hearing any and all questions that you might have. I hope you'll ask them with any language that you have. So all questions are welcome here, and we're going to spend a good deal of time at the end with those. So talk a little bit about myself. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. I grew up on Ralston Avenue. So those of you who are familiar with South Orange, grew up about 2 blocks from the public library. We were just right before people were checking in, I was admitting that I was old enough to have actually gotten my first library card at the old library, because I was born in '63 and the new library was built in '69. And I actually remember going in there with my mom and my sister. So I went to Marshall School. I went to what was at the time the South Orange Junior High School. and I went to Columbia High School. And through that time, I didn't know any out LGBTQ plus folks. We didn't have any folks in our family that identified that way, and none of my friends were out. I later realized I had many friends who were part of the communities, but none of them were out at the time that I graduated from high school, which I think back on a lot, and not at all to blame Columbia High School. In fact, I think they were pretty progressive for their time, but it makes me really sad to think that I really didn't know a lot of my friends. They weren't allowed to be authentic. They didn't feel safe coming out at school. One in particular, a young man at the time, named Robert Kaufman, who was a gay man, and I had no idea. And he was a friend, but he always sort of had some kind of wall up. And I realize now that that's probably what it was. And he died of AIDS very, very early in the epidemic. And I think about him all the time, and it upsets me that I never really got to know him for who he really was. So, that kind of played into my journey. I always felt like LGBTQ plus inclusion was a no-brainer, but I would not have called myself an ally. I really wasn't doing anything about it. Honestly, I didn't know the word ally within a social justice context. It wasn't really being used when I was growing up in that way. I didn't know there would be a role for me. I wasn't sure I'd be welcome actually in the movement because I didn't have any connection to the communities. And so I did nothing for a long, long, long time. And then for my 40th birthday, my husband gave me a book on the women's suffragette movement. And I was doing the thing that I do when I read history books, which is putting myself back in that time period and thinking, like, how would I have behaved if I had lived back then? And I had pretty much convinced myself that I would be marching right alongside all those wonderful women who fought for my right to vote. And it just suddenly hit me how hypocritical I was being. That I felt strongly about LGBTQ plus inclusion my whole life, and I hadn't done anything about it. So the next morning, I looked up the word gay in the phone book. Anybody old enough to remember the phone book? It sounds so weird now when I say that. Thank you, Keisha. So I literally looked up the word gay in the phone book. At the time, the agency that I worked for was called the Gay Alliance, a very outdated name, but in some ways, thankfully, they hadn't changed it yet, and I was able to find them by looking up gay. And I called and asked if I could volunteer the very next day, and started my journey as an ally. I worked for that agency for 3 years, 2.5 years as a volunteer, and then they hired me as the education and outreach coordinator, which put me in charge of all of the educational programs. And then I worked there for 15 years total. In my final 5 years, I was the education director. And you heard a little bit about what that entailed, but basically it meant that I was in charge of writing all the curriculum and training all of our speakers and crafting all of our workshops. We had some workshops that were really popular that we were taking across the country, and I was seeing the impact that we were having. And basically the participants in our workshops were often saying, I'm scared into silence. I'm so afraid that I'm going to say something wrong or use an outdated term, and I'm just silenced with that fear. And our workshops were able to help those folks get out there and get active. And I saw the impact we were having on folks, and reading the feedback from these workshops. And this stuff was so good that at some point it just clicked, and I decided I need to put this into a book. Which is what I did. It literally is the guidebook that I wish I had when I first started, because I knew nothing. And I wanted someone to just tell me what to say, tell me what not to say, tell me what the cultural faux pas are, tell me the action pieces that I can use to really create change. And that's the book that I wanted to write. So my next step, looked out there to see what was out there. And there are a lot of really good books for allies, but I have to say most of them, even if they say they're a book on how to be an ally, most of them ended up being books on why to be an ally with a little bit of action at the end. So even though they were advertised that way, they were like 70% why to be an ally with lots of great stories. And then a little action chapter or two at the end. I knew I wanted my book to be like 100%. Here's stuff to do, right? Here's respectful language tips. Here's action pieces you can do in the workplace or at school or in your faith community. And then the other thing that I really liked, and I really appreciated, both Michael and Keisha touched on this a little bit, but I really wanted my book to be accessible, not a heavy academic book that you have to slog through, but something that people actually picked up and found was fun to read, was engaging. They were looking forward to reading it and reading more of it. I added some pop quizzes and some fun facts throughout it just to kind of keep it light and fun. And I tried to add some humor where it was appropriate. I think I'm funny. I hope other people do. We'll see. But anyway, it was a really, really fun book to write. And then it was published on March 12th, if you can picture that. So arguably the worst time in the history of the world. And really, it was really kind of sad because I had a book launch set up and a whole bunch of workshops. And of course, everything was immediately canceled. None of it happened. My editor was furloughed and my publishing company suspended operations for months and months and months. And so probably 95% of the publicity and promotion ended up falling in my lap, which is why I'm so especially appreciative of folks like you that have invited me in to talk today about my book. So that's just a little bit about my journey. I was also asked to do a short reading. And what I think I'll do is I sort of plan maybe a 10 or 15 minute reading, probably more like 10, it's pretty short. But I picked out a section to read just to sort of give you a sample of my style. And I'm going to follow that with a really quick pop quiz just for fun. And then I think we're going to open things up for Q&A. Does that sound like the right program here?
Sounds good to us.
Okay, good. All right. So my book is broken up into 4 different sections, and I'm reading from the section that has to do with taking action to create more inclusive spaces. It's chapter 9, and the title of the chapter is Straight Pride Parades and Special Snowflakes, Addressing Common Questions. So this chapter begins with a quote, as all of my chapters do, and I really like this one. I think it's very lovely. It's from a man named Anthony Van Brown, who is an Australian, an ex-minister, and a gay man who's now an author. And he writes, "Instead of wondering why there isn't a straight pride, be grateful you've never needed one. Celebrate with us." And I thought that was a really lovely way to start this chapter. So during my 15 years as an LGBTQ plus educator, some questions have taken me by surprise. For example, do you think that homosexuality is caused by aluminum cans? Yes, I did get asked that. I had no idea how to respond. Does your husband know you're a lesbian? I thought that was funny too. FYI, I'm not a lesbian. I'm straight and I'm cisgender, which means I'm not transgender. But a lot of people assumed I was a lesbian. I was the only one at the Alliance where I worked who wore Birkenstocks, which I thought was pretty funny. And one of my all-time favorites, I was running a program called The Power of the Ally in a diversity conference. And someone wandered into my training and asked if we were going to be talking about military strategies. So that was a good one. You know, he heard the word ally and he somehow thought I was going to share military strategies, which I didn't, because I know nothing about military strategies. Other questions are extremely common and seem to come up again and again. As allies, we should be familiar with these common questions and be prepared with appropriate responses. The following are 9 very common questions that are well worth your savvy ally time to become familiar with, as well as some suggested responses. So I'm going to just read 2 tonight. So the first one is very common. You've probably all heard it. I just treat everyone the same. What's wrong with that? Lots of folks think that if they are treating everyone the same, then they are putting in enough work toward creating an inclusive world. They feel that they do not need to learn about different groups of people in order to be fair and just. This comment is similar to, I don't see color. Both of these are hot button comments for many people within marginalized communities. What a great opportunity for an ally. We are in a prime position to step in, assume good intent, meet people where they are, share what we know, and offer them a safe place to figure it all out. So an excellent place for an ally to begin when we hear this question is to take a deep breath and remember that it comes from a kind place. The people I've talked with who have asked this question are folks who think that treating everyone the same is the best way to fix an unfair or biased world. Our job is to thank them for their kindness and their commitment to making the world a better place, and then help them learn an even better way. There are two strategies I use to help people understand that we need to do more than simply treat everyone the same. One is explaining the difference between equality and equity. The other is helping people understand that we all have our own experiences as intersectional beings, and that treating everyone the same is at best unproductive and at worst offensive. First, let's think about how we can effectively educate others about the distinction between equality and equity. I find that sharing concrete examples and personal stories, either my own or borrowed stories that I have permission to share, is one of the most effective ways to help people understand concepts. Below are two examples of how a person might explain the difference between equality and equity to someone. The first involves defining the terms. The second gives an example of how these two concepts can play out in the world. Which do you think would be more effective in response to the person who treats everyone the same and thinks that their work is done? Example 1. Equality means everyone is getting the same things or being treated the same, but this will create fairness only if everyone has started in the same place and has the same needs. Equity is about giving individuals what they need to succeed to live happily. And then example 2 is, equality is handing every soldier a pair of size 10 boots. Equity is handing every soldier a pair of boots that fits their feet. Your instinct may be to share dictionary definitions of concepts, but concrete examples that people can grasp and understand are often the truest tools for education. Personal stories that demonstrate concepts can be even more powerful. What follows is a personal experience I like to share when I explain equality versus equity within an LGBTQ plus framework. So I've already shared that I'm not part of the LGBTQ plus communities. I'm a straight cisgender ally. When I go into a medical office, I get handed a form to fill out just like everyone else, equality. As a straight cisgender, married, monogamous woman, I typically breeze through that form without any issues. Basically, I am the soldier with the size 10 feet. If I'm a lesbian, trans woman in a polyamorous relationship, that form is unlikely to fit for me. I won't see myself represented with the very limited M or F boxes. I won't be sure how to respond. I will wonder if the form is asking for my biological sex or my gender. Either way, this medical office will not be getting a complete picture of who I am. I'm also unlikely to see my relationship status represented with the usual boxes of married, single, divorced, and separated. This medical facility is treating everyone the same by handing them the same form, but the form doesn't actually fit for lots of people. When we look hard at what treating everyone the same means, we often discover that it means that we are treating everyone as if they were white, straight, cisgender, monogamous, hearing, able-bodied, and middle to upper class. The second way an ally can approach this topic with someone who feels good about treating everyone the same is to help the person understand that individuals have different identities, beliefs, abilities, experiences, and needs, and they don't necessarily want to be treated the same as everyone else. The way I make this concept personal is to offer examples of how I treat my friends when they come over for dinner. When Mike comes over for dinner, I make sure there are nut-free food options since he has a nut allergy. When Todd comes over, I try and keep the number of guests small because he's deaf and it's hard for him to follow conversation in large groups. When Owen and Sarah come over with their little boys, I put out toys. And when Pam comes over, I make darn sure the whiskey bottle is full. I never treat my friends the same. Different behaviors on my part make their time at my house much more enjoyable. So that was the first question with some suggestions on how to respond. I'm going to read one more. And this is actually about a couple from New Jersey, your state. Friends of mine, Susan and Gloria, shared this story with me. Okay. My lesbian friends call each other dykes. Why is it okay for them to do that, but not me? Within marginalized communities, it's not uncommon for people to reclaim or joke around with words that have been or are still being used against them. It's a way to disarm the people who are using derogatory terms and to take back control of an ugly situation. We've seen this with the word queer, which we discussed in chapter 2. However, unlike the word queer, which has become fairly mainstream, there are some hurtful words that are truly off limits for folks not in the community. My friends, Gloria and Susan, a lesbian couple, told me a funny story once. They were sitting in Boston traffic and they noticed two women in the car next to them. Gloria said to Susan, "I bet that's a couple of dykes on their way to Provincetown." They got a closer look and realized that it was their friends. Gloria then exclaimed, "Hey, it is a couple of dykes on their way to Provincetown." Because they told me this story, I might think that it's okay to use the word dyke to refer to my friends, Gloria and Susan, because they had used it. It's not. I might also think that because they shared the story with me, I am in the club, so to speak. So that definitely makes it okay for me to use that term. It doesn't. I have never had the word dyke used against me. It's not my word to reclaim or neutralize. Rather than feel hurt that I'm not allowed to use reclaimed terms, I should feel honored when my LGBTQ plus friends feel comfortable and safe enough around me to use them in my presence and trust me not to misuse them. Using a reclaimed derogatory term will not prove to anyone that I'm in the club. It will just piss people off. If you're not sure what's okay and what's off limits, simply ask. Hey, I heard you use this term blank earlier tonight. I want to make sure that I'm being respectful. Is that an okay term for me to use too, or should I avoid it? So I think I'm gonna stop there. And I thought I'd have some fun with a pop quiz. So I'm assuming folks can chat in. Is that true? Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to give you an example of a pop quiz that's in my book. It's very similar to this one. And then if you'd like to, you can just chime in in your chat with a letter what your vote is. So the pop quiz is, you are guilty of having asked one or both of these questions, and you feel awful. You should, A, give up. You're obviously a terrible person. B, tell yourself it's okay to make mistakes. You get a pass because you're an ally. Or C, remember that we all make mistakes. Allow yourself to be raggedy, but do put in the work to move forward, learn, and grow. So I'm assuming someone can, oh, okay, I can see, here we go. We got a C vote. Another C. All right, 2 votes for C. You're correct, savvy allies out there. So basically the answer is, of course, C. You will actually find that my pop quizzes in my book tend to be more to make a point than especially difficult, as this one. It was a little obvious which way to choose. But one of the things that I say, I'm not going to go into, a lot of my book has to do with respectful communication tips around language. I'm not going to go into a lot of that tonight. Obviously, we don't have a ton of time to talk about that. But one of the things I think is important to mention as far as making mistakes is that I really feel like being an ally is an ongoing journey of messing up, making an appropriate apology, forgiving ourselves, and then putting in the work to get it right the next time. And repeat, like we're just going to mess up constantly, and that's partly how we grow and how we learn. And so the idea of somehow arriving, like I'm done, you know, I'm the ally now, or somehow the goal of being a perfect ally, that's really not the right way to look at it. We really should be out there having conversations, messing up, apologizing appropriately, and figuring out how to get it right the next time. So one of the tips that I share in my book about messing up, because people get very, very concerned about messing up. And a really typical example of messing up might be like using the wrong pronoun for someone or using an old name accidentally. And what I like to share with people about messing up is that the best way to respond is to respond as if you bumped into them on the street. So if we bump into someone on the street, we're unlikely to walk by without saying anything because that's rude, but we're also not going to, sob on their shoes and, beg their forgiveness and make a big scene because it's just not that big a deal. We're just going to say, I'm sorry, and then move on. I think that most people, especially most people who read my book, they're already interested in being an ally and being a better ally, are more likely to do the second, to overly apologize. And unfortunately, what happens there is that we get in weird situations where the person we just misgendered is all of a sudden in a situation where they're comforting us. Like it's suddenly become about us. Wait a minute, how did that happen? So we want to make sure that that doesn't happen. So we just make a simple apology and then move on and then get it right the next time. And I do share a lot of tips in my book about how to get it right the next time, ways that we can kind of cement things in our brains if we get tripped up. So I think I'm going to stop there just to leave lots of time for Q&A. If that sounds good.
Yes, that does sound good. I don't know, do any of our viewers who are on now have any questions that they'd like to ask? Feel free to put those in the chat. But Jeannie, I have a question for you.
Sure.
Just being the librarian that I am and working with a lot of kids, I think for the community that we live and work in, South Orange, Maplewood, being very progressive and being very supportive of the LGBTQ plus community, we have folks who aren't there yet, who haven't reached a point where they're comfortable for whatever reason. And so that trickles down into their family. Would you ever consider perhaps doing a YA or children's adaptation of this to perhaps ease the conversation or give a visual aspect so that families could have this conversation? I think this is really good for adults and it reads very well, but I'm just wondering for those families who may be quote unquote a bit more traditional, would you ever consider doing something?
I suppose I actually haven't. It hasn't occurred to me. My editor was immediately asking me what my next book was going to be. I'm like, next book? What? I mean, almost when this was done, I was like, oh. I did picture a workbook. Like I kind of had an idea of doing something like that, especially around all the pop quizzes and just kind of having fun with it. I thought that might be fun. I was thinking more of like folks who were in social work school, for example, school to be counselors, teachers. Might be a nice piece to have in the curriculum. But I feel like there's so many good things out there right now for youth that I'm not sure it would be necessary. I love some of. I wish they were out when I had kids, when I had little kids. But I love some of the books that are out now around just different kinds of families. The picture books, King and King, just fantastic. And I just think that the normalizing of those relationships is going to be the key in moving forward. So again, if we're looking at a community where we have some folks who are just really not quite on board, I see that cultural shift happening with the normalization of LGBTQ plus people and families and lives. And what that looks like is, I really think that as young as kindergarten, we should be reading books about all kinds of families. And that just doesn't mean just the family, with who's got two moms or two dads, but if you think about how many kids these days really are like being raised with mom and dad and the white picket fence, you know what I mean? Like some are, but like some are, like in foster families, some are being raised by grandma or grandpa, some have a single parent. And so I just feel like we're doing a disservice to our children to not be representing all of those families. And it should just be a natural part of the conversation. That didn't specifically answer your question, Keisha. I guess the answer is no, I hadn't thought about that. You certainly planted a seed in my head about that. But I think I just think that that's sort of the key to moving folks forward. And I also just have to say that South Orange Maplewood is so progressive. I was so pleased. This was years ago now, but I remember the New York Times did an article on Maplewood, New Jersey, and it was the most LGBTQ plus friendly community in the, New York area. I was so proud.
Yeah. You answered the question. I think the key word is normalizing, different structures. And, there really is no difference. We look at families and they're different from us, but I think the key word is normalizing.
Yeah. And actually, can I just say one more thing around those lines? Because it just made me realize another point. One of the things I talk about in my book several times, because it's such a huge stumbling block, is that I think that one of the main reasons that LGBTQ plus inclusion gets stalled out is because people confuse orientation with behavior. And what I mean by that is, we'll go back to that school setting or the setting with young children. People hear LGBTQ plus and something goes on with their heads. Not everyone, but there's a tendency to think about sex. the bedroom and what's going on in that bedroom and what's happening sexually. And so people get confused when they hear about talking about LGBTQ plus people in the classroom. They suddenly get fearful that the conversation is going to be about sex, when of course it is not. We bring our orientation to everywhere, to school, to work. It's part of who we are. Our sexual behavior stays home. So, I like to give the example of, if I'm a teacher and the students say, Ms. Gainsburg, what'd you do over the weekend? If I say, oh, my wife and I saw this great movie, that's fine. If I say, oh, my wife and I tried this great new sexual position, no, right? Not okay. And people, for some reason, there's this double standard around what straight folks can say and talk about and what LGBTQ plus folks can. And I think as allies, and those folks who are listening in and wondering how they can be better allies, understanding and being aware when you hear that, the way it tends to play out in workplaces is, I don't think it's appropriate for people to talk about their orientation at work. That's an example of someone, I think, who's confusing orientation and behavior. And so allies can really help by listening to that and realizing when people are confusing orientation and behavior, and just helping clarify that. And I think it's huge with children, and it's huge with inclusion in schools, because people are really worried that we're going to be talking about sex, and when of course we're going to be talking about families and who you love, right? And having a math problem that says, John's 2 moms bought 5 pizzas and blah blah blah, like that's normalizing, that's bringing orientation into the classroom as it should be.
Great. One of our guests who's watching has to go, but I wanted to get his question in before he did.
Okay.
He says, the gay community has been more accepted by mainstream America, but the trans community far less so. Do you have any thoughts on why that is so?
I agree. Absolutely. We're seeing that here as well. I think that's true. I think trans folks confuses a lot more people. I'm often hearing people say like, oh, okay, I get the gay or the bi thing or the lesbian thing, but I don't get this trans thing at all. And I think the more people understand trans identities, when we now are, if they're understanding that folks can be non-binary, people are using, the pronoun singular they, that stuff gets so confusing for people. Like, wait, people don't identify as a man, or a woman, like this concept, I think, is very difficult for people. I think the visibility wasn't there as well. Like if I think about when I started, which was 2003, there, like the trans, you hardly ever, you didn't meet out trans people. Like they just were not out. I think it was too risky and not enough conversations were happening around that. And I think they didn't feel safe, at least here. So whereas we're seeing out lesbian, gay, bisexual people, the trans community was very hidden, and we're really seeing a change there, I think, over the last almost 2 decades. But I think most of the work right now that I end up doing does tend to be around trans education, because people are really confused by it. I think the bathroom issue, like, unfortunately, like, can't we just all pee and peace out? Like, it's just ridiculous. But I think because we literally, have to go into gendered boxes when we use the bathroom, that brings a whole different level of unsubstantiated fear, but fear. Whereas with, orientation, that isn't something that occurred. So that's something that I'm seeing, again, society push back on, things like that. Yeah, I mean, those are just some thoughts off the top of my head. But I mean, and then actually, let me just also say that not just trans, but interestingly, also like asexual, pansexual, bisexual, like those identities as well, I think were also fairly hidden in 2003. Like the conversations when I first started really were around gay and lesbian, and those were the folks who were more out and able to be authentic and vocal. So I think there's a lot of communities. Intersex is another one that I think we're finally, I mean, there was so much unfortunate shame and secrecy around intersex folks. And I think we're finally starting to see some more visibility there, although it's very slow. So it is trans, but I think it's a lot of these other identities as well that have been very hidden and are starting to really come out and, be more authentic, thankfully.
One question I had that kind of goes with what you're saying. In one of your chapters, you present a series of, I think you call them components, gender expression, sexual orientation. And I think traditionally those things get presented as sort of 3 or 4 options. It's male, female, or intersex. You're attracted to men, attracted to women, or attracted to both. And whichever one you're in, that's a box that you're in. And it comes with all kinds of norms and expectations and stereotypes. But you present a different way of looking at that, more of a continuum idea. Could you talk about that?
Yeah, sure. So yeah, I mean, if you just think about how many people there are in the world, right? I mean, so many different identities, so many different sort of layers to our sex, our gender, and our sexuality. So, in my book, I break it down. It's not just mine. I mean, you go on, Google this, and you will see this is, being talked about by everybody. But there are basically 5 components. And we do tend to think of them. I mean, so I'd say initially we thought of them in a very binary way. So I'll give an example. When I was going through school in South Orange, like I learned in biology class, like there were males and females, we dissected frogs, like we didn't even know about intersex people. And we were using an outdated term at the time anyway, I think we learned about intersex folks marginally, not even people actually. I think we were learning about animals. It was very limited, but everything was very binary. I certainly didn't know anyone could identify as anything other than man or woman, boy or girl, until I started doing my work at the Alliance. So the idea that even gender identity is a continuum. But I think, if we look at, I think the easiest one to think about for folks who are just starting to learn about these different continuums is gender expression. So gender expression is basically the way that we express our gender to the world. And that's very culturally defined. So, it's defined by, how feminine or masculine we are, or how androgynous we are. And of course, who gets to define that stuff? I talk about that in my book. I'm like, I don't know. Like, I don't know who gets to define what's feminine and masculine. It kind of irritates me. But if I asked, folks tonight, like, create a list of what's considered feminine and what's masculine, we all know this stuff. Like we could come up with it because it's part of our culture and our society. But I think gender expression, we are more familiar with folks who, how that can be a blending, right? A blending, a continuum, even from day to day. I mean, like when I present, not virtually, I'm sorry, I get a little sloppy when I present virtually. I get comfortable. When I used to present pre-pandemic, I would dress kind of in a feminine way. I tended to dress in skirts and dresses. When found in my natural habitat at home, I'm in like men's boxer shorts or, like big, again, men's, I'm labeling it, but more masculine clothing. So even in the same day, I can dress in an attire that's very feminine to very masculine. This continuum is ongoing. And of course, it's not just our dress, it's our hairstyle, it's our, the way we move, how much space we take up in a room, things like that. But I think if that may be a good starting point if you're teaching people about the continuum, because that's so clear to folks that, that is a continuum. It's not male, it's not, masculine, feminine, and androgynous. It's you can kind of blend and mix and be anywhere on that continuum. And if you think about that and then move that into sexual orientation, for example, that I think that may be a smoother understanding, but all of those are on a continuum. And interestingly, in my book, I start with a very binary mapping because it's a much simpler way to understand it for folks who've never thought about this stuff. And then at the very end, I talk about how I run into problems with that because it's not perfect. And I show a different graph, which actually shows the like masculine and feminine on 2 different lines. So you can actually sort of be this much feminine and this much masculine and move the lines this way. So there's lots of different ways to draw it out. None of them are perfect, unfortunately. But I think more than anything else in my workshops, that continuum, those 5 tiers, has like blown people's minds. Like people like me who are straight and cisgender and never had to think about this stuff. Like I just fit so easily in those boxes. My parents expected me to be straight. Doctor said it's a girl, fit for me. Like I never thought about this stuff. And for those folks like me who never thought about it, this stuff is like mind blowing the first time you see it. I remember just being so wowed by this stuff. And so fascinating. And we all can map ourselves out. That's another fun thing I do in workshops is I actually map myself out. And at first I was like, I'm going to be so boring. I'm going to be all over one side. And I really wasn't. Like when I thought about gender expression, I'm like, okay, like, no, I'm very kind of all over the place when it comes to gender expression. So anyway, that was kind of a long-winded way to answer that.
Well, Jeannie, we have 2 more questions. Oh, Michael.
Go ahead, Keisha, go ahead.
We have 2 more questions, and the first one actually I think is a good follow-up to your last answer. Do you find noticeable generational divides in the people in your workshops?
Well, I'd say no divide. It's a continuum. Ha ha ha. That was a joke. Okay. In my workshops, I would tend to say, well, I guess it depends on the workshop. So optional workshops, obviously folks want to be there. And I get a real mix of people with different ages, which is just beautiful. When I run mandatory workshops, which means folks have to be there, that's where I start to see more of the pushbacks, the folks that really don't want to be there. I'd say yes, a little bit. I mean, I think the younger folks get this. I think they understand it better. I think they, in general, are more like, this is no big deal, for sure. We see that when we do education in schools. The students are really the ones that already kind of get it, and it's the parents and the teachers who have a lot of questions, not necessarily are like anti, but just have a lot more questions. They didn't grow up knowing this stuff. Like I didn't learn this stuff in school. Maybe they're learning it now. I hope so. But yes, so certainly with information, I'm seeing that. But one of the stories I love to share is that I hate to generalize about like groups of people in general. I'm sure this person didn't mean that by the question, but I hear so many stories of people who, for example, like trans folks who were so scared to tell grandma or grandpa that they were trans. And then they have these great stories where the grandma was the one who was like, well, that kid's wanted to be a boy his whole life. What took you so long? You know, like they're like the first one to get it and like be welcoming to their grandchild. So we just hear these amazing stories of resiliency. And, so I certainly don't like to make those sweeping generalizations that older folks don't get it. My parents live in a senior living facility a mile from here. And it's been so neat to have people like have learned what I do. And I have a lot of folks come up to me and quietly, because they, I think, also have those maybe stereotypes about older people that they're not out about their grandchild, but they come up and tell me like how proud they are because their grandchild is transitioning or whatever. So, yes, I think in general, it's a trend that older folks didn't grow up with this stuff, and it's a harder learning curve, but I'm an optimist. I think we're getting there. That's a great question. I think one of the biggest generational things I hear mostly is with the word queer. I talk about that in my book a little bit, but queer is a word that really has been reclaimed and a lot of folks love it. And in general, the older generation does not, because it was used in a very hurtful way against them typically. So that's a sort of a definite generational divide that I see with that word anyway. I'm sorry, Keisha, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
Oh, no. Thank you for that. I'll let Michael ask the next question before we wrap up, but I just want to say that, in sharing that you were going to be with us this evening, I said to a local college professor, and she said, so that'll be really good. I hope I can make it. But she also commented that your book would be a really good book to have in, college curriculum, just to have it as a teaching tool, which I totally agree with. And I'm happy to share it with any professors who I come across. So
thank you. Appreciate it.
Welcome.
And I have to agree. I think it'd be perfect for that.
There's no bias there.
So the next question that came in the chat actually dovetails with something I had wanted to ask. So I'll just preface it by saying, you know, is it too obvious to say that we live in a hyper partisan culture? I mean, everything is politicized, from mask wearing to avocado toast. It's all there, and we all retreat to our echo chambers. So I was wondering if you've seen, if that bleeds into the work you do, and how this, and then the question that we got here, how this administration has affected the work that you do and the questions you receive.
Whew. There's a lot there. I agree. I think we've never been more divided. It's been a rough year. I guess what I want to say about being divided is that one of the things I talk about, so one chapter I dedicate completely, it's called Good Talk, the art of something conversations. I should know this. Hang on, let me just make sure I'm getting it right.
Having useful conversations.
Thank you. The art of having useful conversations. That one is 100% about communicating with folks who think differently than you. And it actually has nothing to do with LGBTQ+. It can be across all sorts of different topics. But I think that chapter is one of my favorites, and it really gives a lot of tips on how to talk with folks and listen to folks who think differently than we do. And I'd love to talk a little bit about some of the tips there, because I think that those tools are just so important. And as you mentioned, Michael, like more important than ever right now. So one of the things that I tend to, like, people in workshops, invariably there's someone who raises their hand and says like, oh, my uncle is so homophobic. Like what can I say to him to change his mind? And of course the answer is nothing. There's no one thing you can say to your uncle that's going to change his mind, because that's not how people learn. And so I talk about how everybody has their lump of knowledge in their brain. And this is stuff we worked really hard to create. And it's all the stuff that we know, right? And when someone tries to give you a new piece of information, we are resistant learners as humans, and we have to be, because life would be chaos if we took a new piece of information every time we got it and we stuck it in our brain and changed it. We literally, the first time we hear something new, we tend to push it aside and say like, nah, that it doesn't fit with my lump of knowledge. So learning, we have to sort of remember that we're resistant learners. There's no one thing you're going to say, no matter how beautifully crafted, to change someone's mind. We are just simply having conversations and planting seeds. And maybe down the line, you're going to plant a seed, and then that person will hear it again, and then maybe again from a trusted source, maybe from, a faith community member or a media source that they trust. And then slowly people make that change. But I think what that does is it really takes the pressure off of our shoulders to come up with that, like, oh, angels singing in the background, perfect thing that's going to change the mind of the stubborn person in front of us, because it doesn't work like that. The other thing I like to talk about when we are looking at having a conversation with someone, maybe they said something that was a little bit ouchy and we're trying to do a little bit of education. Maybe they used an outdated term. Put yourself in the hot seat first. Think about a time when you said something that was accidentally offensive. What worked and what didn't work with interventions that were made for you. And this I find very helpful for educators to think about first, because typically the list that we craft when we do this in a workshop, for example, is like, the person called me out on social media, or the person, called me racist or homophobic, like all these things that make people defensive. They yelled. Things that work are, pulling people aside in a private area, assuming goodwill, assuming that the person is coming from a good place, and they just didn't get the memo on the most updated language. Connecting statements are huge. And what I mean by that is, so I started from zero. Like I said, like when I first started at the Alliance, I knew nothing. It puts me in a really good position to make connecting statements like, oh, I used to think that too. So if someone says, something that's offensive, and it's true, I can say, you know what, I used to say that all the time too, but here's what I learned. That connecting statement puts me on the same level as them, rather than like above here, educating them. I have more tips in my book, but basically the whole chapter is dedicated to how do we talk with folks and listen to folks in a way that opens their ears up rather than shuts them down. I also share an example of a time when I'm in a workshop and a man actually raised his hand, and it was a mandatory workshop, so I already knew I was going to have some unhappy campers in there, and one unhappy camper raised his hand and did push back on what I was saying. He was very upset about the idea of talking about LGBTQ plus folks in the classroom, but he approached it in such a soft-spoken and respectful way that it took me a moment to realize that he was pushing back. Like, he was so polite. And at the end of the workshop, I did something that I'd never done before. I went up to him and I gave him my card, and I asked him if he would have dinner with me and talk with me, because I knew that we could, I sensed that we could have a really, really good conversation and not get angry at each other, because he was so kind. And it was an interesting story. He actually went to his priest and asked if the priest thought it was okay, because he was very nervous about meeting with me. The priest said he didn't see any harm in it. And we went out to the Cheesecake Factory here in Rochester and had an amazing educational experience for me. I don't know for him. I know he had a great time. We hugged when we were done. He said, let's do it again sometime. I mean, it was fantastic. But we just listened and shared. And a few things that really stood out for me were how much we had in common. That shocked me. We were coming at things from completely different sides, and yet we had so much in common as far as like what we wanted for the world and for children. And so that was amazing. And, I think the biggest takeaway was when we got into our cars to drive home, I don't think either one of us, changed an inch on our core beliefs, but we had such a better understanding of where the other person was coming from, and so much more respect for the other person. And I just became a better educator because of it. I became more prepared. He helped me understand how I could have done a better job in that workshop to welcome him and make him feel comfortable, considering where he was coming from. So I just don't think we have enough conversations with people who think differently than we do. Yeah. Did I answer all the questions?
Yeah, I think so. Keisha, do you ever want to ask anything else?
No, I think we covered everything.
So, Jeannie, where can people, well, we'll have it at the library, but where can people purchase your book?
Oh, yeah. I'd love to direct people to my website, which is savvyallyaction.com. There's links to buy my book there. You can pick it up on Amazon if you like that. I have a link to my publisher, sells it as well. I also have just some fun things there. So I call them free ally goodies, but I've got free handouts that you can download. There's one on like how to support your LGBTQ plus child. There's one on creating inclusive spaces in the workplace. And then I also have links to my videos. So one of the things that I did, as I said, a lot of the promotion fell on me. One of the things I did during the beginning of the pandemic was just to create more of a social media presence. Was I started creating every month I create a little 3-minute video, and they're fun, and they've got ally tips. There's one on like what to do when you mess up, and there's one on understanding the pronoun singular they. Those are all up on my website. So I hope folks will take a look at those as well.
Well, Jeannie, thank you so much for reaching out to us, and for those folks who were able to join us this evening. This is being recorded, and so anybody who has missed it will have an opportunity to take a look at it. And as we said earlier, we do have 2 copies available at the library, The Savvy Ally, a guide for becoming a skilled LGBTQ plus advocate. And hopefully, just like Jeannie mentioned, reading the book, seeing this presentation will plant a seed in your mind about how to become a better ally. And Jeannie, we thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. This was super fun. It was nice to meet you all.
Yes, thank you, Michael, and for our audience who's joined us. Ellie, thank you so much.